As we draw closer towards the end of 2018, the question on every Fijian's lips is, when will the general elections be held? Speculations have been made by many, but we have with us tonight our guest, the Supervisor of Elections, Mr. Mohammed Saneem, to discuss matters pertaining to the 2018 general elections. Bulavanaka, and welcome to the show.
Bulavanaka.
Getting straight to it, I'm very curious, and I know that everyone is too. Do you happen to know when the 2018 general elections will be held?
Well, the date for the 2018 general election has not been announced yet, but it will be a date before the 21st of November.
You've mentioned this many times about what the process is, how the date is determined, but for the benefit of the viewers who still don't know how it happens, please explain the process.
The date for the 2018 general election will be announced by the President on the advice of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister will advise the President to dissolve Parliament and issue the writ for the general election, and that writ is going to contain the date for the general election. So if the writ is issued today, the general election will happen 44 days from today.
So once again, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
You have mentioned that the FEO is completely prepared whenever elections are announced, whenever they're held. Does the lateness of the announcement itself affect the preparation of the FEO?
Well, the more time you have, the better time you have to prepare. But we were prepared to conduct an election in from April this year, and as we have continued to grow into the year, the Fijian Elections Office has continued to refine the processes and procedures to ensure that the election is delivered in a more efficient manner.
Before we get to looking at what we can expect with the elections, just one last question about the date itself. Should the date not be announced by the 6th of October, what happens then?
If the Prime Minister does not advise the President to dissolve the Parliament by the 6th of October, from within 7 days of 6th of October, the President will then have to issue the writ automatically for an election to take place.
So let's talk about the Bangkok Declaration of Free and Fair Elections. We know that the FEO is an adherent of this declaration, and so for the benefit of the viewers who may not be aware, can you please explain what this declaration is and how is it relevant to the FEO?
The Bangkok Declarations on Principles of Free and Fair Election was promulgated in 1990, in the year 2012. This follows on from a 1990 or 92 declaration of principles by the Inter-Parliamentary Union. The declaration sets out some of the minimum standards to conduct an election that should be then qualified as a free and fair election. And for the Fijian Elections Office, these documents form a guideline into the development of processes and procedures for the conduct of an election so that we meet the minimum international requirements for free and fair election.
And are these articles that are contained in the declaration also reflected in the relevant legislation?
As I said earlier, some time ago, that Fiji's laws have been developed based on the most current international election practices. The 2014 Electoral Act is a very modern piece of legislation, and as you will note from the MOG report as well from 2014, the electoral system set out by the Electoral Act and the procedures actually complies with a lot of the international principles on the conduct of a free and fair election.
Well, looking at the articles that have been set in this declaration, how many of these are already in place with whatever it is that the FEO has been doing so far?
Yeah. We tested the Fijian electoral process as well as the electoral system against the requirements of the Bangkok declarations, and our assessment is that we meet all the minimum, all these requirements that are there is met by Fiji. If you look at the declaration itself, there are various requirements in the declaration that EMBs, the election management body, has to meet. There are certain requirements that external stakeholders have to meet, and to some extent I would say in Fiji they do meet it. But where it is concerning the election process and the election management body, the Fijian Elections Office and the Electoral Commission duly meet the requirements of the minimum standards under this document.
So you seem very confident in saying that. Let's try to break down some of these articles. Yes. We'll start off with Article 1, the independence of the electoral management body. So the first article requires fearless independence of EMBs. Now in the past you're probably aware that the independence and the credibility of the FEO as an independent and fearless body has been questioned. So in what ways do you meet the requirements under Article 1?
I think the word independence here in Fiji is treated in a very subjective manner. So if the Fijian Elections Office complains against a political party that sits in opposition, then they say the Fijian Elections Office is not independent.
Right.
But if the Fijian Elections Office complains against somebody, particularly to FICAC, who's sitting in government side, then they again say the Fijian Elections Office is not independent. So the bottom line here is not what people are saying, but to look at the activity itself. In exercising the powers of the Fijian Elections Office as the supervisor of elections, or the Electoral Commission, has the body complied with the law in the first place or not? And if we are complying with the law, meaning if someone has not done their declarations properly, and we refer them to FICAC, that is complying with the law. That is our independence. Secondly, independence is not only seen in that area. There are other aspects of independence, such as financial independence. Now, for the 2018 general election, the Fijian Elections Office budget is $20 million. I can assure you, actually, if you look today, the Fijian Elections Office has already been given the full sum of its budget, and it is sitting in our account. This is considered as an international best practice, but it guarantees our independence in expenditure. So we don't have to request for funds from government or from any other agency to say, we need to get 3 more cars, can we get extra $1,500?
Right.
So those kinds of things are independent as well. The last one I would like to say is that previously in Fiji, elections were conducted by civil servants alone. This time around, and as you saw in 2014, the Fijian Elections Office hires ordinary Fijians to work on elections. That guarantees the independence from state as well. So not only independence in terms of our actions, but independence in terms of the framework, as well as from the human resource side. So that is very modern, and I think that all should be considered when making an opinion about independence. Not a scenario-based or case-based, but on a holistic approach.
And you're saying that most of the political parties, when they do comment on the independence of FEO, they take a subjective approach?
Look, it's politics at the end of the day. The referee always has to play by the rules.
Right.
And when the yellow card is shown, you will have some agreements and some disagreements. When a red card is shown, you will have some disagreements and the side which will benefit will say good. The side that doesn't benefit will say not good. So I think people in Fiji already understand that.
Right.
Yes.
So we're touching a bit on dispute resolution processes there,
Yes.
which we will definitely like to get into more.
All right, stay watching, because coming up after this we've got more on that, and also access to voter education, which is Article 3. We'll touch on more on that after this break. Welcome back. Now, Mr. Saneem, we were talking about the Bangkok Declaration on Free and Fair Elections and how the FEO is striving to ensure that these articles, of course, are reflected in the electoral process given this year's general elections. Ziad, you had a question earlier on that you had mentioned.
Right, so if anyone wants to access the Bangkok Declaration, how can they do that?
So we will host the Bangkok Declaration on the Fijian Elections Office website. And we will be printing this in both the daily newspapers on the 17th of September this year, and we will be printing a few other international principles that week from the 17th to the 22nd of September. But on the 17th of September newspaper, both newspapers, you will be able to get your copy of the Bangkok Declarations if you haven't got it online already.
So it's made accessible to the public, and you're also implying that it's open to scrutiny.
Yes. The point is the Fijian Elections Office is required to conduct the elections on the law that is in place in Fiji. These are international norms of conducting elections, and we are aspiring to meet these standards.
Now that, of course, reflects Article 3 of the Bangkok Declaration, access to voter information. Now, why is it so necessary for voters to understand the process and the framework of it?
First of all, an election is all about the voter. It is for the voter to select a representative for the next 4 years. So the voter is the most important stakeholder, and the voter needs to know how to exercise this right. You would notice that in previous elections in Fiji, we used to have invalid votes 13%, 9%, 6%. This was very high number. 13% of 380,000 is about 15,000. That's a lot of people that could not mark their votes correctly and therefore having an invalid vote. So the first and foremost important activity that the FEO has to do is to make sure that voters know that when they go inside the polling station, how to translate their intention onto the ballot paper. That is our first and foremost responsibility. How the voter can translate their intention onto the ballot paper. In Fiji, we have a ballot paper that has got numbers on it. We give voters a booklet that has got the number, name, and symbol, and the photo of the candidate. So the voter is able to select their candidate in the polling station without any intimidation or coercion or any kind of campaign inside the polling station. So that's the foremost important thing that the Fijian Elections Office has to do. And this year we have conducted the first round of Know Your Election program, started in March this year. And there's a second round of Know Your Election program that is going to start from the 17th of September right up until the date the election is announced or the writ is issued.
And of course, a very important aspect of Article 3 is to make sure that disenfranchised and disempowered communities are also taken into account, especially in terms of access to information, because they are the ones who need it more.
Yes.
So for the people who speak minority languages, or people who cannot read or write at all, how has the FEO facilitated them in a better way?
So we do some of these things in elections in Fiji style. Meaning we directly go to communities and conduct a presentation to the communities and have an interactive session. In March I actually went out myself and the commission went out to various rural communities. Our election information booklet is in 6 languages. In 2014 we only had 4. We have now included the Banaban language and as well as the Rutuman language, and these have been distributed widely around the country. Around 400,000 of these books have been distributed. We only have 600,000 voters. We will, in the second round, again go to all these communities. The Fijian Elections Office has a policy of going to communities rather than expecting communities to come to us, which also explains our high rate of voter registration and very high turnout as well.
So because of the sporadic nature of households in rural communities, can you guarantee that each and every household has been informed properly?
So if you want a guarantee, there's various stages of guarantee. Through the media, I am sure that every Fijian knows that there is an election this year. But we have also direct access to a lot of these individuals. We go to community visits. We had the hibiscus contestants over at the Fijian Elections Office. And then we do, we'll have a call center that will be operational, so they will be, the voters will be able to call in and ask for information. So in terms of the presence, accessibility is quite high. So I would assume you can safely say that every Fijian has been made aware of how to handle themselves at the polling station.
Now you've mentioned that it's important to not have elections officials who will be biased towards this election. You've had many trainings happening for your elections officials. How's that been going so far?
In terms of training election officials, we have conducted training for every person that has to work on election day at least once. This is by far more than any other election in the history of elections in Fiji, where officials have been given training before an election, and we're maybe at least 2 months out of an election. So in terms of that, I believe that our staff have the capacity to handle election time issues as well as their own roles. And I'm confident that they will deliver a credible election on election day.
There's also something that's been stated over here about election technology and how staff need to be fully trained and knowledgeable about how to operate it properly. Now this year the FEO has released a new app, and you've given voters and the general public access to voter information and also on provisional results as well. Are your elections officials well trained? Do they have any troubleshooting avenues that they can refer to?
So the staff who will be using firstly, we have taken a very precautionary approach. For any election software or electronic technology that we are using, there is a manual backup. And this year's election, the manual backup takes precedence over whatever is the information in the software, except for the result management system, because that's a very huge spreadsheet. That's why we've got the result management system. But all staff that have to use any application or software have already undergone at least one session of training, and they will be taken through another refresher session just before the event. And we will have teams on standby to assist. We are working with some overseas security consultants so that we can have their teams present in Fiji at the same time, in case there is some, when it comes to internet and technology, there is always security risks.
Right.
So we will be having security overseas companies that specialize in security present in Fiji to ensure that our systems are all safe and protected at all times.
Now this, of course, we're discussing Article 4 here of the declaration, and it also overlaps with Article 14, which is about polling station management on the actual day of the elections.
Yes.
Now this article talks about the importance of logistical support that must be provided to election management staff that are actually there.
Yes.
What forms does this take?
In 2018 general election, we have added an extra layer of staff from polling station to our areas. We're calling them the hub leaders. The intention of having this extra layer is to give more direct localized support to the polling officials. In 2018 we directly managed from area offices, which became complicated at some times, but in 2018 with the presence of hub leaders who will also have vehicles and extra logistics support from staff at their disposal. So we are hoping that in terms of the logistics rollout, our staff on the ground have direct access to somebody who can make some decisions or provide them with backup material should there be a need.
Well, keeping with the theme of informing voters on what actually constitutes a free, fair and credible elections, I'd like to investigate a few more articles of the Bangkok Declaration. More on that coming up after the break. Welcome back. Siad, this is very interesting, looking at all the articles that have been stated in the Bangkok Declaration of Free and Fair Elections. And Mr. Saneem, you've been very helpful in explaining things. Now, before we move on to Section 2, which is the election period, just carrying on, of course, with Section 1, the last article that's over there, facilitating voter registration and the accuracy of the voter list. Can you guarantee that that has been absolute so far?
In terms of the voters register in Fiji, our voters register is an electronic one. Our voters register is compiled by obtaining biometric details of individual voters. This our registration data matching rate is 75%. So that means that if two people's details match 75%, that is thrown out and we actually quarantine it and then we investigate it. Someone sits there and checks. Most of the times you will find that it is the mother to son, where the thumbprints have greater similarity compared to mother to daughter. So that's where the system would actually allow the Fijian Elections Office to verify. So we have an electronic system, we have a system to report deceased voters, and we also have a system where you can object to somebody from being registered as a voter. Now we print our voter lists annually, and we give free copies to political parties of the printed voter list. It's actually called a National Register of Voters. Political parties who would like copies of the voters list can actually get it from the Fijian Elections Office. There's a fee of $1,000. That has not changed from 2014. And this is available to political parties and free updates. So they only pay once a year and we give updates for free. So the voter list in Fiji is verified. When we go out to the villages and settlements, we actually mark against the names of people to see if they're actually still there or not. In 2000 and in February this year, when I went to Bua, we were sitting down at the village, and the Turangani Koro sat down with my divisional officer, and they were actually ticking off people who were still in the village and those that had moved.
I see.
So we actually have physical verification as well as electronic verification.
So in the interest of time, let's move on to Section 2,
Yes.
which deals with electoral campaigning. Article 7 places a high burden on the adherence of the declaration in terms of campaigning finance
Yes.
and oversight, providing oversight for campaign finance. So, of course, like a lot has been said in Fiji about campaign financing. And the article, in fact, imposes a rigorous legal framework
Yes.
in those countries. So what powers does the FEO have to provide oversight?
In fact, campaign finance regulations in Fiji are in line with international standards, as MOG has found in 2014. Other countries are actually using the Fijian legislation as a benchmark for their own legislations in the Caribbean, particularly due to our similarities in the physical or the country's makeup. So in Fiji, there is a lot of regulations in terms of campaign, such as companies cannot donate to political parties, only private individuals can. People who are not Fiji citizens cannot donate unless they were former Fiji citizens. There are other requirements for declarations. Those who are office holders of parties, they have to declare their assets, liabilities and income. So that gives voters the opportunity over a period of time to compare whether initially this person had X dollars and now how many zeros are added next to the X, literally in the bank. So those are some good practices that we have in Fiji.
Well, looking at all of that, does the FEO itself have the powers, or does it have the resources to actually help manage or to
Implement. Because
rather?
I mean, you can have the best laws in the world, but
Yes.
if you don't have the capacity to implement those laws, then they're useless.
So what we do is once declarations are made, we have the powers under the Section 24 of the Act. We write to all banks and investment houses and get confirmation of all these details. FRICA, FNPF, everybody gives us the confirmations, and if the numbers don't match, then we refer the person to FICAC for investigation. We have referred quite a few of the office holders to FICAC, and we will continue to implement the law.
Well, a lot may be said about vote buying. How does the FEO plan to have an eye or stringent measures in place to make sure that this does not happen come this year's general elections?
I think vote buying, social media has made it quite easy for us. People do pose with candidates, and if they've been given a gift, they like to hold the gift with them. So it allows policing that very easy. But we are also conscious of the fact that there are other forms of vote buying that may be concealed, and this is in terms of promises. And I think we have actually, with an arrangement through FICAC, to go after people who are using false promises or inducements in terms of the election. Even we have referred complaints about business owners who are telling their employees, if you don't vote for this party, we'll close down and things like that. So we are keeping an eye on those.
Right, but it can be a very difficult distinction to make, right, between what's actually campaigning and what's vote buying. So let's say, for example, if the government rolls out a new initiative that's close to the election, someone can say that it's vote buying. But how do you make the distinction?
There are things like, when you look at these, you analyze whether it is part of a previous plan. So, for example, you look at whether this was something that was coming. There is a national plan for 20 years in Fiji. You look at that. You look at other policies that have been previously enacted that indicates whether something like this will happen. But there is always the fear of incumbency. There is always a complaint about incumbency in elections.
Right.
So we have to deal with that on a balance of scales.
And of course that relates really well to Article 11, which deals with the use of government resources in the lead up to the elections. Now, we would like to discuss those billboards that have been going up. A lot of things have been said in relation to those.
Yes. What are your thoughts on that, and how is it that people have all these thoughts about it, but the FEOs remain quite silent on that?
So this is our position on the billboards. From our own queries with the company, these billboards are paid for privately by Fiji First. And since it is an arrangement between Fiji First and the company, and the campaign rules on this from the Electoral Act apply once an election date is announced, there is not an issue that the Fijian Elections Office will take up.
So the regulations requires that government resources are not used in those campaigns.
So yes, these are not government resources.
These are
privately
Fiji
paid for by Fiji First, which is a registered political party.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, before we wrap up this second segment, sorry, not the second segment rather, but this section of the Bangkok Declaration, just looking at military and police interference, there's, you know, this is Fiji, let's face it, we've had quite a political turbulent time in the past few decades. There may be speculations by some, maybe some political parties or some provisional candidates might go around trying to incite fear of threats and violence. What's your stand on that?
We have a very active functioning electoral security advisory group made up of FACEC and the police. This group is in charge of election security, and we assure every voter that should someone come and threaten or induce you or coerce you in voting in a particular manner, the Fijian Elections Office will be using the services of all available authorities to ensure that the voter is protected firstly, and that you are not bullied or subjected to coercion before you cast your vote. The protection is there, and these agencies will be there for you.
Right, so let's quickly discuss the codes of conduct that are in place.
Oh, I'm sorry to cut in there, Ziad,
Right.
but it seems like we've run out of time during this segment. We'll discuss more on the codes of conduct with the Supervisor of Elections after the break. Welcome back. Mr. Saneem, we were discussing the different articles that have been put in place by the Bangkok Declaration of Free and Fair Elections. Ziad, you were mentioning something about Article 15.
Right, so Article 15 addresses the rights of minority groups, and the question that I had was some of the minority groups that we have in Fiji, either by ideology or by ethnicity, or of course many other factors to consider. And of course, you don't have a control over the system of elections that we have in Fiji. So let's just discuss the 5% threshold. 880,000 population. For minority groups to reach the 5% threshold, do you think that it essentially disempowers them in some way?
I think the minority question in Fiji has to be looked at differently. Because of our electoral system, it's not that you should advocate for a group-based political party. The political parties that we have registered in Fiji have to have a national approach. That's why when they register, they have voters sign up from various parts of the country in various numbers. So essentially the threshold would be the target of the party. And if you look at party frameworks, the parties can actually adopt principle to say, okay, X is recognized as a minority, we're going to have 5 people from this minority as part of our 51 candidates, so that once the election is over, voting is finished, the persons from that minority, if the party wins 10 seats, and one of the minorities has got enough votes to be in the top 10, that person is represented in parliament. So it's not constituency based where you have to field enough, you have to field your candidate to do the work, but in fact minorities have a greater chance of entering parliament in the current system because they can attract votes from all over the country. So the whole 631,000 voter base is your voter base, not only your community. And in fact this kind of system promotes your venturing out from your small pocket groups, but into more nationalized approach.
But it is somewhat, I would say that it does serve as a disadvantage to an independent candidate. So would it be more advisable for someone to go for the party?
So this election should be considered on the basis of the framework that's there. So if you want to be an independent, the system allows you to be one. But if you say this is a game and you know the rules of the game, you play based on the most strategic way to win.
Right.
And so we don't discourage or encourage any form of competition in terms of contesting as a candidate or independent candidate, but a person must look at what their possibilities are of success and then decide.
Moving on, since we are pressed for time, this is of course the fourth segment. Still looking at Article 15 before we quickly move on. FEO of course has done quite a lot of work that is inclusive of for all voters, even those who have disabilities. Recently there was a short video that was posted on the Fijian Elections Office Facebook page about those who have disabilities and how they will be taking part in the voting process.
A significant change from 2014. The law, the Parliament has approved the Persons with Disabilities Act, which now facilitates that a person who suffers from disabilities can seek help from a person of their own choice at the polling station. So this is a significant movement from 2014, where only election officials were responsible for helping persons with disabilities. This gives a lot more confidence and convenience to persons with disabilities, and I'm sure that the staff of the Fijian Elections Office, who are already there, in the event there is nobody to help, the FEO staff have been trained in this manner to help persons with disabilities.
So Article 16 deals with voters living abroad, and I know that the FEO does facilitate this as it was done in 2014. Could you give us some rough numbers, how many overseas voters have registered so far?
We have about 7,900 people from overseas that are registered to vote, and they will all be eligible for postal voting. Once the date has been announced, they can apply for a postal vote, and the process will go on from there.
So we'll move on to one of the more controversial articles, I guess, the accreditation of observers. Now, there has been a collective call both by the multinational observer group after the 2014 election to have more domestic observers. Can you tell us more about this?
First of all, I have to say that observers are approved by the minister responsible for elections. The Fijian Elections Office does not recommend nor does it invite observers. In terms of domestic election observation, technically if you look at a domestic election observation, there are GINDM principles. There's a global organization for domestic observation missions. There are GINDM principles for election observation by domestic observers, and if there is any agency in Fiji that is considering domestic observation, they should follow the law and apply it to the minister for approval. They might find the GINDM principles quite useful for their activity.
Looking at Article 20, the printing, counting, consolidating, transporting and storing of ballots. Now, a lot of political parties, candidates and also officials have started making a bit of a hue and cry about the previous elections being rigged, and that this one may be too. Now, with this in place, and I know that FEO is definitely going to be adhering to this to make sure that this election is credible, what do you have to say to that?
First of all, about the 2014 election and the heinous allegation of rigging, we called out on Mr. Chaudhry to come up with evidence, and Mr. Chaudhry didn't. And from 2014 till now, he has no evidence. So I don't think he has any credibility when he says something like that. And I think Mr. Chaudhry should rightfully apologize to the Fijian public for such statements. But in terms of the storing and transporting of ballots, you would remember in Western Australia after the 2013 general election, 2,000 ballot papers went missing. There was a report compiled afterwards, and it recommended various protocols on storage of ballot papers and materials. Our processes for storage and transportation of ballot materials complies with those requirements set by the Australian committee that was established to look into the missing ballot papers. So as far as our material storage and transport are concerned, we are confident that the ballots will be safe and secure, and any person who wishes to confirm can verify that from the Australian standards that are there.
Thank you for that comment. To wrap up this segment, I'd just like to say that coming up in the fifth and final segment this, after this break, we'd just like to quickly touch on the complaints and electoral dispute resolution, which is Section 3, the final section of the Bangkok Declaration, and also on some of the allegations and also statements that have been made by Swadalpa leader Sitiveni Rambuka. More on that after the break. Welcome back. Mrs. Neem, looking at the last few things before we wrap up this show.
Right, so let's discuss Section 3. We'll wrap it up with Article 22 and 21, that deals with the complaint systems that should be spelled out way ahead of the elections, and also the various systems of investigation and dispute resolution. What does the FEO have on that?
First of all, the Fijian Elections Office launched the Polling Agents Handbook in June 2017. In the handbook, we designed a sample form for complaints, and this handbook was given 1,000 per party, and parties have been asked to use that complaint form on their letterhead. So once a complaint is received, it is sent to the Supervisor of Elections. I will consider the merits of the complaint. If an investigation is necessary, that will be done, and after an investigation we will respond to the complaint. If the party is still not satisfied, they can appeal to the Electoral Commission, and within 2 days, and their decision of the Electoral Commission is final.
Well, because we're pressed for time, just highlighting, of course, what I had mentioned in the previous segment, the issues that SODALPA leader Sitiveni Rambuka had actually put together in a submission, and he'd rather lodged this with the Electoral Commission in late July and early August 2018. One of them being the refusal of the Electoral Commission to confirm party polling agents who would be shown ballot papers by presiding officers on polling day.
Yes, I think we have clarified this quite well. Party agents will have the ability to see ballot papers, as it will be placed right in front of them. They can stand next to the table as long as they are able to see the ballot paper, and I think that should resolve this matter. You can see the ballot paper as count is progressing.
So what about the refusal of the Electoral Commission to give guidelines on electronic gadgets that may be taken into the National Results Centre? At
the National Results Centre, we have permitted political parties to bring in their own gadgets. So if someone wants to bring an iPhone, someone wants to bring an iPad or a laptop, they are entitled to bring that. They will be giving them free Wi-Fi, or they can have their own Wi-Fi, as long as they are able to use these gadgets for their own use.
So these parties have also expressed their disappointment with the decision to choose some venues as pre-poll venues, and they're baffled as to why some of those were designated as pre-poll venues.
See, when we went out in 2016 and 2015 and asked these parties to come back to us about their comments on these venues, they didn't. Now when the election is around the corner, they are jumping up and down about these venues. I think what we should say, crying over spilled milk. What they should have done was in 2015 and 2016, when we asked them, they should have responded to us. They haven't done that. Now they're jumping up and down. I think for the next cycle, for the next election, they need to be more alert when we next time ask them for consultation.
Right, because after the previous election, a lot of political parties as well as the MOG, they recommended that there should not be a change in legislation or any kind of law too close to the election.
Yes, and all these places that are under pre-poll, people deserve the Fijian Elections Office to bring elections to them. These are remote areas. These are areas where the boat depends on the tide, how to get to these places. So I think the Fijian Elections Office has done the assessment in consultation with the local organizations like the Turangani Koros, and this assessment will stand. Parties need to know this is not changing. Elections will take place in those areas under pre-poll. They need to prepare their agents accordingly.
But they've also alleged that some of these areas are accessible by road. They're very accessible. And is there a review process?
The process was in 2015, 2016 when they didn't respond.
When they didn't make submissions.
So now,
that's fine.
Even if it is accessible by road, these are remote areas. If it is 20 kilometers from the main highway, it might take an hour to get there, and we can't hold polling for that long.
Right.
I'm sorry to cut you off on that particular comment, Mr. Saneem, but since we're pressed for time, just the last two questions. One of the other points that Mr. Rambuka had made was the refusal of the Electoral Commission to confirm that counting at polling stations will begin at 6 p.m. on polling day.
Mr. Rambuka should read page 19 of the Polling Agents Handbook, which has already very clearly said that when the last voter in the queue at 6 p.m. has voted, the polling day workers will immediately set up the counting station. So there is, I don't know why that has not been made clear to him.
Well, there's so much more that I'd like to ask, but it seems we're out of time. Your final message to voters out there?
This week and until the election date is announced, maybe your final opportunity to update your voter details. Please do so. The Fijian Elections Office from the 22nd of September will be setting up hotspots around the country for any last minute changes that you wish to do. Once the writ is issued, you cannot change your details. So voters can take this opportunity to correct their details and ensure that they're in the right polling station. and one more from me.
Yeah.
The Fijian Elections Office will be publishing a lot of international, some international declarations on free and fair elections and principles for general elections. I would urge voters to read this so that you yourself are able to know what a free and fair election by international standards is, not what somebody decides between their morning tea and breakfast.
So thank you very much for joining us on the show today. We've managed to get some very important clarifications done, and we wish you all the best for the upcoming elections.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, that wraps up our show for tonight, and should you feel the need to make inquiries with the Fijian Elections Office, you can call them on 331-6225 or send an email info@feo.org.fj or visit their website feo.org.fj. Until next time, have a pleasant evening.